This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 696 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. I had this moment on Thursday where I realized that I forgot to talk about one of my sleeper picks from the Sleeper Show. So on this Mailbag show, I'm adding a player to the mix, Nico Collins. He's rostered in 20% of Yahoo leagues, and he gets the Raiders secondary that's been the sixth best opponent for wideouts in adjusted fantasy points allowed. And Collins has averaged a 19% target share per game over his last four. And he should have a touchdown based on his production. But he's yet to find the end zone. So Nico Collins, add him to the list. Now that that's out of the way, I want to send another reminder about the GMC Sierra Mountain Climber Pick'em, a free-to-play contest series that gives you a chance to win a share of $10,000 in FanDuel site credit every Sunday, courtesy of GMC. Here's how it works. Every Sunday during the NFL season, you'll have a chance to answer questions based on the day's 1 p.m. and 4:25 p.m. games. The more questions you answer correctly, the higher up the mountain you'll move. If during any week you answer every question correctly for a perfect score, you'll reach the summit and win your share of $10,000 in site credit. The contest series is now live, so head to fanduel.com/free/contest/GMC to start climbing the mountain. The first mailbag question this week is from Patreon, and it's from Logan. It says, in PPR, 4 of the top 5 highest scoring non-quarterback players are wide receivers. Due to positional scarcity, running backs are often valued around or above wide receivers who are outscoring them. This can be concerning for those of us who drafted running back heavy and are starting a running back in the flex spot when it seems starting 3 wide receivers would be more optimal. How would you navigate this, especially when league mates may be hesitant to give up a wide receiver for a, quote, similarly ranked running back who is putting up fewer points? So there's a lot to unpack here. First off, you're kind of noting this in the question, but value in fantasy football generally comes from how a player is performing versus his position, not across positions. I say generally because flex spots do exist. Now, I know you're bringing up running backs versus wide receivers because of those flex spots. But stating that 4 of the top 5 highest scoring non-quarterback players are wide receivers, that doesn't really tell us that much. What you're trying to say here overall, not wrong. But solely with that information, the top running backs could still be more valuable than the top wide receivers. Because you need baseline numbers to really grasp the value of the position. But let's keep this conversation a little bit simpler. I've talked about this plenty through the years on this show. But if you're in a full PPR league, your flex spot should more than likely go to a wide receiver. Like entering your draft, you should go with a more wide receiver heavy approach. Just to give you an example of why this is the case. If you look at the last 5 seasons of fantasy football, and you look at the average points per game of the RB1, the RB2, and so on, and you do the same at wide receiver, top running backs have scored more PPR points than wide receivers. But once you get to like RB9, RB10, that starts to flip. And wide receivers begin scoring more points than running backs throughout the rest of the rankings. And that gap between wide receiver and running back just starts getting greater and greater and greater. Like at RB48, the average has been 7.6 PPR points per game. And this is among players who played at least 8 games. At wide receiver 48, that number's 10.1. So the wide receiver 48 over the last 5 years has averaged 10.1 PPR points per game. The RB48 has averaged 7.6. And this makes total sense. More wide receivers are seeing consistent work, and they're catching more passes. An RB3 or an RB4 in fantasy football is relatively replaceable. And all a wide receiver needs to match an RB3 or an RB4 is like 3 or 4 catches a game. What we're seeing this year is definitely a down year for high-end running backs, which is what you're noting in the question. Over the last 5 years, the RB1 has scored a little over 26 PPR points per game. The RB2 has been at 22.8. The RB3, 21.3. So at running back, you're at 26, then 23, then 21. This season, we only have 2 running backs over 20 points per game in PPR leagues, and none of them are close to that 26 mark. Now, this is going to be a little bit tough to explain on a podcast, but I'm going to try my best. I actually compared this season's top running backs and wide receivers by points per game versus the last 5 years' average. So this year, our top running back, Austin Eckler, he scored 23 points per game thus far. That's over 3 points lower than the average that we typically see from the RB1 in fantasy football. When you do that at both running back and wide receiver, you find that nearly every single top 12 running back spot this season is scoring fewer points. They're scoring fewer points than the average over the last 5 years. If we were looking at positional value, then we'd also have to know how the rest of the position was performing. Because think of it this way. What if all running backs were scoring 1 fewer point per game? Then that would be all relative. The position would be scoring less, but the value of the higher end players wouldn't be dramatically changing. They would change in the flex spot, but not within their position. That just hasn't been the case. Lower end running backs are scoring more than we typically see. Higher end running backs are scoring less. In other words, that range is being shrunk, making those top running backs less valuable. And then the opposite is actually happening at wide receiver. This doesn't mean that this is the way it's going to be for the rest of the season. Plenty of higher end running backs actually have some favorable regression heading their way. But it's not like we should have all the confidence in the world that higher end running backs will all of a sudden have the same historical advantage over the higher end wide receivers. It seems likely we're going to have a season where higher end running backs are worse from a value standpoint. So when you say, quote, how would you navigate this, especially when league mates may be hesitant to give up a wide receiver for a similarly ranked running back who is putting up fewer points? I would first say that I'm not sure there are just generally accepted rankings. How one person views someone is going to be different than how another person views them. But rest of season rankings across the industry are absolutely more wide receiver heavy right now than they were before the season. And they should be. But I'd also say that your league mates aren't valuing them improperly. Wide receivers are more valuable in PPR leagues where you can flex players. The higher end players at the position are performing better than the higher end running backs. They should be valuing wide receivers more. So how you navigate that, if you're trying to get one of those wide receivers, you're going to have to give up more than you probably think. If you're trying to get a deal done, that's what you have to do. Because that's actually what their value is. And if you're like a 1-5 team, maybe a 2-4 team, you may just have to hope that regression hits for some of those higher end running backs. You have to play into variance a little bit more. But I think the lesson here is that in PPR formats where you can flex players, I don't advise that you go with some robust RB strategy. It's much more advantageous to go with a wide receiver heavy approach. And this is absolutely not me being reactive. My rankings reflected this entering the season, and I've talked about it before on this show. It's the proper way to draft in those formats. So given the answer to that question, this next question is kind of funny. It's from @PFF Commenter. It says, what happened to zero RB this year? I'm constantly working the waivers, but my starting running backs are Eno Benjamin and A.J. Dillon currently. None of my stashes are panning out. Was hero RB the way to go? So I've said this time and time again on this show, and I wrote about it in the late round draft guide. In many fantasy formats, hero RB is very, very often the best approach to the running back position. But this is absolutely not a bad year for zero RB. It just sounds like you personally didn't hit on the position. But Josh Jacobs fell in a lot of leagues. Ramondre Stevenson, Miles Sanders, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who we know is a little bit overvalued, but he at least gave you some really good games. Dameon Pierce in more home leagues. Devin Singletary hasn't been bad. Now I'm going to wait to the end of the season to sort of see how this year compares to other seasons. But there were some really strong middle round running backs who have looked great so far this year. Kenneth Walker's another example. I think that when you do analysis on this kind of thing, though, you have to look at more than just the running back position, right? Because there's an opportunity cost involved. Higher end wide receivers, like I just talked about, they're doing great. I mean, if you look at the top 10 or so wide receivers by points per game, none of them were drafted past round 5 or 6, and the majority of them were top 2 round picks. Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews are crushing it. Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, all crushing. When you go zero RB, you're taking on those types of players. Thus far, it's been a pretty good year for zero RB. It just sounds like you've had your own personal struggles with it, which can absolutely happen. That can happen with any sort of strategy. But that doesn't take away from the larger trends. This next question is from @GoatWaddles. It says, are offseason bold call pieces bad? Are they at all valuable? Everyone was somewhat in on Juju, so this isn't calling out that specific prediction. But it feels like it makes us focus on 1% outcomes and not see the whole picture. Some of this is definitely how the human brain works. We get this grand idea in our head, and it's hard to get it out, even if we're told that it's not likely. It's why we buy lottery tickets despite the odds. Just wondering, maybe it puts people's minds in the wrong place for drafting. As a fantasy football analyst, I get a front row seat to negativity bias. This is straight from Google, but it's a great definition. Negativity bias is a cognitive bias that explains why negative events or feelings typically have a more significant impact on our psychological state than positive events or feelings, even when they are of equal proportion. I have to really be careful about how I answer this question, because people will undoubtedly walk away from this podcast thinking that I'm complaining or that I'm defending a bad take. Please understand that's not the case. I'm just explaining what I see on a daily basis. But negativity bias is really what you're experiencing here. You read a bold predictions piece, which any person reading or consuming understands that it's looking at the outer range of outcomes. Like someone consuming a bold predictions article or a bold predictions podcast inherently understands that these predictions will not pan out at the same rate as normal analysis. We can say that humans just get excited and they take them too far, which is what you're getting at in this question. But I would strongly argue that negativity bias is at play here too. With a bold predictions piece, the reason they're written and the reason that they work for content creators is because they're interesting and people remember them more. Like, what do people remember from my offseason? The fact that I said that I liked Allen Robinson at ADP? Or the fact that the headline in a bold predictions article said that Juju Smith-Schuster would be this year's Cooper Kupp? One of those statements is far edgier than the other. So people remember that thing more. That's not where the negativity bias comes into play, though. It's sort of this compounding effect where you remember the bold prediction stuff more, but you also remember the wrong ones more. Do you know how many times people have mentioned the fact that I said that Juju Smith-Schuster would be this year's Cooper Kupp? Like, I get it. It was sort of an insulting headline. I even recognize that. The literal first line in that blurb that I emailed out to everyone, and I quote, "No, I don't actually think a 1,900-yard season is in Smith-Schuster's range of outcomes." But the headline was catchy, wasn't it? I did like Juju Smith-Schuster, though. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to defend this take. I liked Juju this year. That's looking like an L. But people remember that edgy, wrong thing that I said in the bold predictions piece. That's what they're going to remember more. You know what they don't remember? The fact that in that exact same bold predictions piece, I said that Chris Olave would outscore Michael Thomas. The fact that I said Ramondre Stevenson would score 40 more PPR points than Damian Harris. The fact that I said Deontay Johnson would finish as a wide receiver 3. Or how David Njoku would outscore Pat Freiermuth. I got plenty of stuff wrong in that article and on that podcast too. I called Elijah Moore a freaking wide receiver 1. I said Chase Edmonds would be a top 15 running back. Trust me, I'm not sitting here patting myself on the back and saying, I don't get many things wrong. Look at all these things that I got right. What I am saying as a fantasy analyst, and this goes for any person who's making predictions about the future in front of a group of people. When you get things wrong, you hear about that 100 times more than the things that you get right. And it's not because people are jerks. It's because that's what people remember. And it's totally fine. I signed up for this. This is my job. I'm not complaining here. I'm simply answering this mailbag question by saying that the problem isn't the bold predictions piece. It's how human beings latch onto the things that go wrong rather than the things that go right. Think about your local weather person. They predict the weather every single day. Do you remember all the times they got the weather right? When they absolutely nailed it? Of course not. You remember when they told you it was going to rain and it ended up being a sunny day. And then you go tell your friends that Teddy Smith is the worst meteorologist that you've ever seen. Like, I totally get it because I do the exact same thing. I'm human. I think what's healthy, though, is to recognize that it exists and that negativity bias is very, very, very real. So I don't think bold prediction articles are bad at all. I think they can be pretty thought-provoking. I just think that humans remember the negative things without realizing that there can be a lot of good in something that we see as bad. This next question is from @69ersFF. It says, how do you handle the Aaron Jones situation? Green Bay keeps underutilizing him when he's obviously the more efficient running back. Do you hold and hope for better days or shop him after a good week? So this year, Aaron Jones is averaging 13.4 PPR points per game. Last year, that was 15.3. So he's not doing as well as he did last year, and that's despite the Packers losing Devontae Adams. And he is seeing less work this year, but it's really not by much. Last year, he had a 49.4% running back rush share per game rate while averaging 11.4 rush attempts per game. This year, his rush attempts per game is actually up by 0.3. His running back rush share is down by about 0.6%. So he's basically been seeing the same work on the ground. Through the air, his target share per game is down by 2 percentage points. That's a blow, for sure. He's seeing 0.5 fewer targets per game. So yeah, he's seeing less work overall, but given it's been 6 games, it's actually pretty in line with where he was at last year. It's just that people were hoping that he'd see more work overall, and he's not. The Packers' offense is just not nearly as good, and Jones is seeing fewer touchdowns. He's averaging 0.33 touchdowns per game this year. That was double that amount last year. So the bigger issue for Jones right now is that Green Bay's offense is averaging 2 offensive touchdowns per game. Last year, the number was over 3. So I think that he's a hold for the time being. Green Bay's offense has some moving pieces, and Jones still has the upside of just getting more work naturally, but also getting more work with an A.J. Dillon injury. And that's usually not priced into a running back's cost. So right now, in my opinion, you're probably selling him a little bit too low. This next question is from @GarbageTimer. It says, why do you think so few trades happen in most leagues? People are afraid to take risks. It's much easier to live with the consequences of not doing anything than if you actively go do something. Everyone wants to get a lopsided deal without realizing that to get a deal done, both sides need to win. You should be open to trading anyone on your roster. People aren't open to that. In order to live with a trade that they made, they need it to easily, and I mean easily, look better for them on paper. That's why I think trades don't get done. People are afraid to make a bad move because it's tougher to live with those consequences than if you were to stay put. This last question is from @just_Robin94. Are you sounding the alarm on Christian Kirk yet? If not for being bailed out by a touchdown last week, he was on pace for another bad showing. So something I've noticed a lot this year, and I'm not necessarily saying it's happening here with this question, but people are drawing conclusions about individual players instead of looking at what's going on at the team level first. It's sort of like what I talked about with Joe Flacco versus Zach Wilson earlier this week. The Jags have now scored 5 offensive touchdowns over their last 3 games. Over their first 3, that number was 10. It was 2 times as much. The offense was clearly playing better. The offense has not been good over their last 3 games. And this past week, they had a 40% pass rate. That was the lowest of their season. It's going to be difficult for wide receivers to thrive in that kind of environment. And if you look at their 2 games prior to last week, one of them, Kirk had a low target share and he had a bad game. That's going to happen. One was a game played in awful weather where Kirk saw a 39% target share. So a bad weather game, a bad offensive performance, and a 40% pass rate. This certainly is not solely a Christian Kirk thing. The truth is, Kirk's target shares haven't been dramatically different. Over the first 3 games of the season, he was averaging a 25.1% target share per game. Over his next 3, it's been 23%. And that includes a game where he had a 7% target share against Houston. Now, of course, Jacksonville's offense might just continue to be super run heavy and be really bad. But I just think it's really important to put that team level context onto player performance. It helps tell our story about a player a little bit better. It helps us understand why they're producing the way they're producing. I'm not sounding the alarm though, no. The Jags have a pretty average schedule for wide receivers in both the short and the long term, and Kirk is consistently seeing great target shares. And he's shown to have the ceiling that we want out of a fantasy football wide receiver. He was a full-blown wide receiver 1 to start the season. It's always possible that he doesn't work out, but I'm definitely more on the side of not panicking, at least right now. There are specific circumstances that have led to these performances. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out LateRound.com, join the Patreon, subscribe to the newsletter. I can't tell you guys enough about how awesome the Late Round Fantasy Football Discord community is, and you get access to that through Patreon. So check it out, LateRound.com, and sign up. Thanks for listening this week, everyone. Really, really appreciate it. Good luck in week 7. I'll talk to you next week.